A retired soldier is walking back toward the loudest, most dangerous place on earth. He was done. His service was complete. He had earned the right to never hear another sword drawn in anger. And yet here he is, choosing this, choosing the front of the line, choosing the tip of the spear, choosing to walk toward 50,000 men who want him dead. What makes a man do that? What kind of general earns that kind of loyalty? Caesar's army that morning numbered 22,000 legionaries against Pompey's 47,000. 1,000 cavalry against 7,000. An army that had been routed 6 weeks earlier, that had survived on root bread and shame, that was outnumbered in infantry 2-1 and in cavalry 7-1. Contemporary records, Caesar's own account confirmed by multiple ancient sources, document these numbers precisely. There was no ambiguity about the disadvantage. Everyone on that field could see the mathematics. Caesar's outnumbered, battle-damaged army destroyed Pompey's force so completely that Rome's greatest general fled the field disguised as a commoner. But here is what historians have never fully explained with tactics alone. Why did Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus, a man who had cleared the Mediterranean of pirates in 3 months, who had defeated Mithridates, who had earned the title the Great at 23, abandon a position of overwhelming strategic advantage and descend onto a flat plain on the very morning his opponent was preparing to march away? This was not a man who made impulsive decisions. This was not a general who had ever needed to. Something happened in Pompey's camp in those final hours that no ancient source fully documents, that no chronicle completely explains. The behavior is recorded. The reason lives in silence. You will discover the specific tactical innovation Caesar prepared months in advance, an instruction so psychologically precise that it appears in Rome's official military handbook 60 years later. You will discover that the first man to charge across the Pharsalian plain was not a general, but a retired centurion who had voluntarily re-enlisted and who told Caesar to his face that he would earn his gratitude, living or dead. And you will discover that among the men Caesar pardoned in the hours after his victory was the senator who would drive a dagger into Caesar's body 4 years later. To understand why Pompey made the decision that destroyed him, we need to go back to the moment 100 years of institutional rot made this battle not just possible, but inevitable. The Battle of Farsalus was not, at its core, a conflict between two ambitious men. It was the final payment on a debt that Roman institutions had been accumulating for a century. To understand what happened on August 9th, 48 BCE, you have to understand what the Roman Republic had become by the time Caesar and Pompey arrived at their collision, and how completely it had already failed. The fault line ran through the heart of Roman political life. On one side stood the optimates, the entrenched senatorial aristocracy, men who believed the Senate's authority was the Republic's foundation and that any challenge to it was tantamount to tyranny. On the other side stood the populares, politicians who leveraged popular assemblies, military commands, and the support of Rome's landless urban poor to bypass the Senate's obstruction. These were not, strictly speaking, political parties. They were orientations, factions, ways of doing business in a system that had grown too rigid for the empire it was managing. Caesar was the populares tradition incarnate. His family connection to it ran through his blood. His aunt had married Gaius Marius, the self-made general who had transformed Rome's army from a property-owning citizen militia into a professional force whose soldiers swore loyalty to their commander rather than the state. Caesar understood from youth what that shift meant. An army that follows a man will follow that man anywhere, even across the Rubicon. The mechanism that made civil war inevitable was more specific. The breakdown of the first triumvirate. the informal power-sharing arrangement that Caesar had forged with Pompey and Marcus Licinius Crassus around 60 BCE. Three men, three sources of power: Pompey's military reputation, Crassus's enormous wealth, Caesar's political genius, and enough mutual interest to keep Roman politics functional for nearly a decade. The arrangement was never stable. It was always a temporary equilibrium held in place by self-interest and, importantly, by the marriage of Caesar's daughter Julia to Pompey himself. Crassus died at the Battle of Carrhae in 53 BCE, killed in a catastrophic defeat at the hands of the Parthians. Julia had already died in childbirth in 54. With those two deaths, the equilibrium collapsed. The financial moderator was gone. The familial bridge was gone. What remained was a growing rivalry between two men who had always been competing, now with nothing to restrain them. By 50 BC, Caesar's decade-long command in Gaul was ending. He sought to return to Rome and stand for the consulship while still technically commanding his legions. A legal maneuver that would maintain his immunity from prosecution by the senatorial enemies who had been documenting his alleged irregularities for years. The Senate, increasingly terrified of his military prestige, his enormous personal wealth extracted from Gaul, and the army of devoted veterans at his back, demanded he surrender his command first. Caesar proposed mutual disarmament. Pompey and the Senate rejected it. Then when the Senate issued the Senatus Consultum Ultimum, the emergency decree that effectively declared Caesar a public enemy, the legal architecture of the Republic shattered. On January 10th and 11th, 49 BCE, Caesar took Legio XIII Gemina across the Rubicon River and into Italia proper. Legally, this was an act of war against Rome itself. What happened next revealed something more important than Caesar's ambition. It revealed the Republic's condition. The Senate had assumed that Italian towns would close their gates to Caesar and rally to defend the ancestral constitution. They did not. Pompey, who had famously boasted that he could raise armies simply by stamping his foot on Italian soil, evacuated Rome rather than defend it. He retreated to Brundisium and then across the Adriatic to Greece, and taking most of the Senate with him. The Republic's claim to popular legitimacy, its foundational assumption that Roman citizens would defend Roman institutions, collapsed within weeks. The Battle of Pharsalus was where that collapse became permanent. But it did not begin at Farsalus. It began a century earlier, in every failed reform, every murdered tribune, every instance where the Senate chose its own preservation over the health of the state it was supposed to govern. What crossed the Rubicon in January 49 was not simply a general with a grievance. It was the consequence of a system that had been breaking for 100 years and had finally run out of time. 8 years in Gaul had made Gaius Julius Caesar the most famous man in the Roman world. They had also made him the most hunted. By the summer of 48 BCE, as his army approached the plains of Thessaly, Caesar was 51 or 52 years old. The exact year of his birth remains disputed among ancient sources, with the traditional date of 100 BCE placing him at that age, though some scholars argue for 102 BCE. What is not disputed is what those years had produced: a military record without parallel in his generation, a political instinct that had outmaneuvered every opponent he had ever faced, and an army whose loyalty to him personally was something the Roman military tradition had no institutional language for. Caesar's family was patrician, but not wealthy. The Julius Caesares had more history than money and more ancestry than influence. He claimed descent from Venus through the Trojan prince Aeneas, a lineage that would prove militarily significant at Farsalus, when he reportedly vowed a great temple to the goddess before the battle began. What shaped him more concretely than divine ancestry was his family's political tradition. His aunt Julia had married Gaius Marius, which positioned Caesar from youth in the Popularis faction, not as a philosophical commitment to the lower classes, but as a practical understanding that political power lay increasingly outside the Senate's walls. He was, by contemporary testimony and by the evidence of his own written works, exceptional in almost every domain he attempted. An elegant prose writer whose Gallic Wars commentaries were acknowledged in his own lifetime as Latin literary masterworks. An orator of the first rank, a politician of remarkable flexibility and nerve. And above all, a military commander whose defining attributes were speed, surprise, and an ability to project complete calm in circumstances that broke lesser men. That capacity for calm under pressure is documented across his campaigns in ways that go beyond hagiography. At the Battle of the Sabis River in 57 BCE, when the Nervi launched a surprise attack that shattered multiple Roman legions simultaneously, Caesar is recorded as running from unit to unit, personally steadying formations, snatching a shield from a soldier in the rear ranks because he had no time to arm himself properly. At Dyrrhachium, a battle we will return to, when his own panicking soldiers nearly trampled him in their flight, he physically attempted to stop them. His account of his own near death in that moment is notable precisely because he includes it. Caesar was not above recording his own humiliations. He was too intelligent to pretend the enemy had never gotten the better of him. The Gallic Wars from 58 through 50 BCE were the engine of everything that followed. 8 years of campaigns produced 3 things that no Roman political career could manufacture by itself. Enormous personal wealth, transferred from conquered Gallic territories to Caesar's own treasury and the pockets of his troops. A force of veterans who had been fighting together in some cases for a full decade, forged into a cohesion that conscript armies and hastily assembled eastern levies could not replicate. And a political following among Rome's landless poor that made Caesar's name synonymous with possibility, with the idea that the Republic's machinery could be made to work for ordinary people again. 6 weeks before Pharsalus, this formidable apparatus had suffered its most serious reversal. At Dyrrhachium, in modern Albania, Pompey had identified a weakness in the southern sector of Caesar's circumvallation lines. The 17-mile network of fortifications with which Caesar had attempted to besiege Pompey's much larger army, and had launched a 3-pronged assault that shattered the Caesarian position. Caesar lost over 1,000 men and 32 military standards in what his own account describes as near catastrophe. He records personally attempting to rally fleeing soldiers and being nearly killed by his own men in their panic to escape. His remark about the battle is preserved in his own commentary. Had the enemy been led by a winner, he wrote, the war would have ended that day. He retreated into Thessaly. His army was hungry, demoralized, and outnumbered. The men had survived for weeks on bread made from an edible root called chara, ground and mixed with milk, a detail recorded in multiple ancient sources, and which has the ring of documented fact rather than rhetorical invention. Pompey, upon seeing loaves of this bread reportedly thrown over his walls by Caesarian soldiers in a gesture of defiant self-sufficiency, remarked that he was fighting beasts rather than men. The man who stood on the Pharsalian plain on August 9th had just lost the most important battle of the campaign. He had crossed a sea in winter, been routed in a siege, and retreated across mountains with an army living on roots. He remained, despite all of this, the most dangerous military mind in the Roman world. The question was whether the army that trusted him still had enough left to prove it. To understand what was lost at Farsalus, you need to understand what Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus actually was at the height of his powers. not the hesitant, politically pressured figure who descended from the hill on August 9th. The man he had been for 30 years, because the tragedy of Farsalus is incomprehensible without that context. Pompey was born on September 29th, 106 BCE, in Picenum, on the Adriatic coast of Italy. His family was wealthy, but not part of Rome's established aristocracy. They held influence in their region, but were not, by the standards of the Roman senatorial class, truly Roman in the deepest sense. His father, Gnaeus Pompeius Strabo, was a general of competence and ruthlessness, serving as consul in 89 BCE during the Social War. When Strabo died in 87, Pompey, 20 years old, legally vulnerable in a chaotic political environment, used his father's estates and his father's veterans to raise 3 legions from his own resources. He was 23 years old the first time his soldiers called him Magnus. The name came from Africa and Sicily, where he had pursued and destroyed enemies of the dictator Sulla with a thoroughness that alarmed even Sulla himself. Magnus's, the Great, was a nickname earned through blood, applied first by his own troops and then confirmed as a formal cognomen. After Sulla, however reluctantly, granted Pompey a triumph that the young general had technically not qualified for under Roman law. His other nickname from this period, applied by his enemies, was Adulacentulus Carnifex, the teenage butcher. What followed over the next 3 decades was a record of military achievement that had no precedent in Roman history. In 67 BCE, Pompey was given an extraordinary command to deal with the pirates who had been terrorizing Mediterranean trade routes. He swept the sea clean in 3 months, a campaign that ancient sources record with something approaching awe, given that previous commanders had spent years failing at the same task. In 66 BCE, he received command of the war against Mithridates VI of Pontus, Rome's most persistent eastern enemy, and defeated him comprehensively. He reorganized Rome's entire eastern frontier, established client kingdoms, collected client kings the way other men collected debts, and returned to Rome in 61 BCE, having tripled Rome's annual revenues. He celebrated 3 triumphs across his career, an accumulation matched by almost no one in Roman history. The assessment that historians have preserved, drawing on ancient sources that include contemporaries who knew Pompey personally, is revealing in its precision. Pompey's tactics were typically efficient, but not innovative. He won campaigns by organizing superior logistics, outmaneuvering opponents gradually, and denying them the ground and supply they needed to fight effectively. He was, in the judgment of ancient commentators and modern military historians alike, an outstanding strategist and organizer who could win wars without displaying tactical genius on the battlefield, and who could prove insufficient when facing a commander who did possess that genius. The same ancient sources note plainly, Pharsalus was his only decisive defeat. By 48 BCE, commanding the combined forces of the Roman Senate and its eastern client network, Pompey had assembled something impressive. Ancient sources, including Caesar himself, Appian, and Plutarch, agree broadly that his legionary force numbered approximately 45,000 to 47,000 Roman infantry. Though modern scholars like P.A. Greenhall have argued the effective fighting strength was closer to 36,000 to 38,000, with the higher figures including men who were not fully combat ready. His cavalry numbered 7,000 riders under the command of Titus Labienus, and his force included a vast array of allied contingents: Galatians, Thracians, Macedonians, Gauls, Germans, Syrians, Cappadocians, and cavalry conscripted from Pompey's own slave households. The internal tensions of this army were real and consequential. The senatorial faction that accompanied Pompey's camp was overconfident to the point of dysfunction. These were men who, in the weeks before Farsalus, were reportedly debating which of Caesar's supporters' properties they would confiscate after the inevitable victory. Which of them would receive which offices in the post-war settlement? Pompey's preferred strategy, a patient Fabian approach that would deny Caesar supplies and allow disease and desertion to erode his force without risking a pitched battle, was strategically sound and politically untenable. The senators around him demanded a swift conclusion. What no ancient source fully explains, and what sits at the center of this story's deepest mystery, is the precise nature of the pressure that brought Pompey down from his hill on the morning of August 9th. We know the behavior. We know its consequence. The internal deliberation is not preserved. What we can say with confidence is that 30 years of military success had created an environment around Pompey in which numerical superiority was assumed to be decisive. And that assumption, more than any tactical error, is what lost him the battle. And in January of 48 BCE, Caesar did something so tactically reckless that even experienced military officers considered it bordering on madness. He loaded 7 veteran legions onto whatever transport ships he could assemble and crossed the Adriatic Sea in winter. Ancient Mediterranean seafarers considered the winter sea closed. The combination of unpredictable storms, reduced visibility, and hostile currents made the crossing genuinely dangerous in ways that could not be mitigated by planning or courage. Caesar did it anyway, landing near the village of Paeleste on the Epirote coast without the Pompeian fleet commander Marcus Calpurnius Bibulus even realizing the crossing had happened until Caesar was already ashore. This was Caesar's defining attribute in action. Not genius in isolation, but genius deployed with an audacity that consistently caught opponents miscalculating the risk he was willing to accept. He chose to arrive in Greece with 7 legions sooner rather than 11 legions later, because he understood that the political and strategic cost of delay exceeded the physical cost of crossing dangerous waters. His remaining 4 legions, under Mark Antony, were blockaded at Brundisium by the Pompeian fleet and could not immediately follow. Caesar was in enemy territory, outnumbered, cut off from half his army and most of his supplies, and in the middle of winter. What followed was one of the most ambitious engineering projects in ancient military history. Unable to match Pompey's larger army in open battle, Caesar constructed a circumvallation around the Pompeian position at Dyrrhachium, a network of fortifications spanning approximately 17 miles, incorporating 24 forts and a continuous system of trenches and walls. The goal was to cut Pompey off from land-based forage, making his cavalry useless and demonstrating to the watching world that Pompey the Great was a besieged man. The psychological calculation was as important as the military one. The siege produced suffering on both sides, though of different kinds. Inside Pompey's lines, water was scarce and fodder for the horses had run out, generating disease among the livestock. For Caesar's troops, the situation was grimmer. Cut off from their supply lines in Italy, they foraged in terrain already stripped by the Pompeians. But it was during this period that the Cara bread episode occurred, documented in multiple ancient sources and too specific to be invention. Caesar's legionaries discovered an edible root, ground it, mixed it with milk, and baked it into a dense, hard bread that sustained them through weeks of shortage. They reportedly threw loaves of it over Pompey's walls as an act of defiant psychological warfare. When Pompey saw the bread, ancient accounts record that he commented he was fighting beasts, not men, and immediately ordered the bread kept from his own soldiers' sight, recognizing its potential to demoralize them. The siege ended badly for Caesar. On July 9th and 10th, 48 BCE, Pompey had been provided intelligence about a gap in the southern sector of Caesar's fortification, a stretch where the wall had not yet been completed. He launched a coordinated three-pronged assault involving naval landings, light infantry, and a frontal legionary push. The Caesarian position collapsed. Caesar lost over 1,000 men and 32 military standards. He personally attempted to stop the flight of his own soldiers and was nearly killed in the chaos. His comment on the aftermath, that the war would have been over that day if the enemy had known how to use a victory, is both characteristically self-aware and characteristically revealing. Rather than pursuing the broken Caesarian force immediately, Pompey consolidated his position. It was his most consequential strategic error of the entire campaign, though it would not become clear until August. Caesar burned his siege equipment, retreated east into Thessaly, and then moved to solve the one problem his army actually had: food. The city of Gomphi solved it, if brutally. When the Thessalian town closed its gates against Caesar rather than submit, Caesar ordered an immediate assault. The city fell within hours and was sacked, a deliberate departure from his usual policy of mercy, executed with the specific intention of restoring his army's morale and demonstrating to the rest of Thessaly that submission was the only viable option. It worked. Neighboring cities opened their gates. Caesar's army, which had been surviving on root bread and the humiliation of Dyrrhachium, found itself in a fertile valley with food, water, and something more valuable than either: the belief that things had turned. Pompey pursued, pressed by senators demanding a swift conclusion to a war that had stretched over a year. He marched south from his position, and by early August had placed both armies within sight of each other on the plain near Pharsalus. The stage was set. The mathematics said everything. What the mathematics did not say was which general had read the other correctly. For 5 days, the two greatest armies Rome had ever turned against itself stood within sight of each other on the Thessalian plain, and neither moved. It is one of history's more extraordinary periods of mutual paralysis. More than 70,000 soldiers in total. The full military and political weight of the Roman world on both sides. And 5 days of watching, waiting, and the slow accumulation of pressure that tends to precede catastrophic decisions. Pompey had established his camp on a hillside overlooking the valley. Caesar's camp sat on the plain below, approximately 30 stads distant, roughly 4 Roman miles, a figure that Appian's account of the civil wars preserves. The positional logic was unambiguous. Pompey held the high ground. He had twice Caesar's infantry and 7 times Caesar's cavalry. He had the river Enipeus anchoring his right flank, and the hills behind him providing both security and a clear withdrawal route toward Larissa if needed. He had food, water, supply lines running north through Macedonia, and the naval support of the Pompeian fleet operating along the coast. His strategy, as described in contemporary accounts and reconstructed by military historians from his subsequent behavior, was patience. He did not need to fight. Every day that passed without a decisive engagement was a day that Caesar's hungry, outnumbered army burned through supplies it could not easily replace. Every day was a potential day of desertion, disease, and declining morale. The sound strategic option was exactly what Pompey was doing. Nothing until Caesar was forced to move or break. Each morning, Caesar led his army out of camp and formed it in battle order on the plain below the Pompeian position. Each morning, Pompey declined. Caesar records his own frustration in his account, noting that he gradually moved his lines closer to Pompey's position each day, testing the response, and that Pompey's line moved somewhat further down the slope in response. A small concession to the psychological pressure, but not a commitment to battle. Caesar was offering Pompey exactly what Pompey's numerical advantage theoretically demanded, a chance to fight on the open plain. Pompey's refusal to accept it was strategically correct and politically impossible to sustain. The night before the battle that followed, Plutarch's account of Pompey's life records that Pompey dreamed of standing in his theater in Rome, being applauded by the citizens as he dedicated a temple to Venus, the goddess from whom Caesar's Julian family claimed divine descent. Whether this dream was actually dreamed, or whether it was a tradition elaborated in the transmission of Plutarch's sources, cannot be determined with certainty. What is documented is that Caesar had reportedly made a vow before the battle. If Venus Genetrix, ancestral goddess of the Julian line, granted him victory, he would build her a great temple in Rome. He would fulfill that vow. The temple of Venus Genetrix in Caesar's Forum was dedicated in 46 BCE, when on the morning of August 9th, Caesar ordered his army to break camp. He had been in the same position for days. Pompey had declined every battle offer, and the time had come to move elsewhere, to find fresh supplies, to keep the strategic initiative, to avoid the paralysis of a standoff he could not win by waiting. The camp was being struck. The tents were coming down. And then, as Caesar records in his own account, with the controlled precision of a man documenting something that still surprised him, he looked toward Pompey's position and saw the Pompeian legions coming down off the hill and onto the plain. Caesar ordered the march stopped immediately. He recalled the troops who were already moving. He had his army reformed for battle. His recorded address to the waiting legions acknowledged, in the framing that pervades his entire account of the Civil War, that what was about to happen was something he had sought to avoid. He called his soldiers to witness his earnestness in seeking peace, his reluctance to shed the blood of fellow Romans, his willingness to have given almost anything to avoid this moment. What we don't know is whether the soldiers who heard that address believed it. What we do know is that they formed up and prepared to fight. Pompey had come down off his hill. The reason remains imperfectly understood. Senate pressure is the most widely accepted explanation among historians. The cumulative weight of overconfident senators demanding the conclusion of a war they were certain was already won. But the internal deliberation is not recorded in any source we possess. But what happened in the Pompeian camp on the morning of August 9th, whatever conversation or calculation or capitulation produced the decision to descend, is one of the genuine silences in this story. We have the consequence. The reason belongs to history's gaps. The plain of Farsalus was not what Pompey needed. It was precisely what Caesar had been hoping for. The scholarly debate about the exact location of the battle has been ongoing for centuries. Caesar himself, in his commentaries on the Civil War, refers to the engagement only as the battle in Thessaly. He mentions no specific town, no specific landmark beyond what his tactical description requires. Ancient sources, including the author of the Bellum Alexandrinum, Frontinus, Eutropius, and Orosius, specifically place the battle at Pharsalus, Old Farsalus, rather than the newer town of Farsalus itself, while Plutarch, Appian, and Polyaenus name Farsalus. The most rigorous modern analysis, John D. Morgan's 1983 study, Pele Farsalus, The Battle in the Town, places the battlefield near the village of Creni, approximately 6 miles north of modern Farsala, on the north bank of the Enipeus River. This reconstruction is now the dominant scholarly consensus, though it has not been confirmed by physical archaeology. What all sources agree on is the decisive topographical feature, the Enipeus River. Both armies anchored their right flanks on it, Caesar's left and Pompey's right, in their respective orientations, which meant the river simultaneously protected each army's most exposed flank while concentrating all the available cavalry maneuver room on the opposite side. This is the key to understanding everything that followed. Caesar deployed his 22,000 legionaries in the traditional three-line formation that Roman military doctrine called the triplex aces, but he thinned his lines to approximately 6 men deep, rather than the standard deeper formation, stretching his front to match the length of Pompey's much longer line. To do otherwise would have left his flanks hanging in open air, inviting the envelopment that Pompey was explicitly planning. Mark Antony commanded the left wing, anchored on the Enopeus, with legions 8 and 9, the latter severely depleted after Dyrrhachium. Gnaeus Domitius Calvinus commanded the center with 6 more legions. Publius Cornelius Sulla, nephew of the dictator, commanded the right wing with Caesar's elite 10th legion, the Legio ex Equestris, and Caesar positioned himself there alongside his wing commander. Behind the cavalry on that right wing, invisible to anyone approaching from Pompey's position, Caesar had stationed a hidden 4th line. He had stripped 1 cohort from each of the legions in his 3rd line, creating a force of approximately 6 to 8 cohorts. Ancient sources give varying figures. Caesar says 6 cohorts, while Appian and Plutarch's accounts imply a force closer to 3,000 men. Consistent with 6 full-strength cohorts, though none of Caesar's legions were anywhere near full strength. And these men were ordered to conceal themselves behind the cavalry screen until Caesar gave the signal. Pompey deployed his legions 10 men deep, nearly double Caesar's formation, creating a dense mass intended to absorb the Caesarian charge and hold the front while his cavalry delivered the decisive blow. He concentrated his best troops on the left wing. Legions 1 and 3, his finest infantry and the very legions that had originally served Caesar before being returned to the Senate, now commanded by Lucius Domitius Ahenobarbus. On this same wing, Pompey stationed virtually his entire cavalry force of 7,000 riders under Titus Labienus, along with all the army's archers and slingers. He took his own command position behind this left wing, positioning himself to oversee the operation personally. The center, commanded by his father-in-law Metellus Scipio, held the Syrian legions, experienced troops but not Pompey's best. The right wing, under Lucius Afranius, consisted of Cilician and Spanish cohorts protected naturally by the Enopeus. Pompey's battle plan was explicit and, in theory, overwhelming. His infantry mass, 10 men deep in excess of 45,000 legionaries, would hold Caesar's charge frontally, absorbing the shock. Simultaneously, Labienus's 7,000 cavalry, backed by every archer and slinger Pompey possessed, would sweep Caesar's 1,000 horsemen off the field, wheel around the exposed Caesarian right flank, and attack the infantry from the rear. The infantry was the anvil. The cavalry was the hammer. Mathematics made this appear decisive. 7 to 1 in cavalry, more than 2 to 1 in infantry, and the knowledge that Caesar's legions were already depleted from Dyrrhachium and weeks of poor supply. What Pompey did not know, what his scouts had apparently failed to detect, was that the hammer had a target waiting for it. Caesar recorded his pre-battle address to his troops in terms that emphasized his reluctance to have arrived at this moment. He reminded them that he had sought peace. He reminded them of the hardships they had shared. He told them what he needed them to do. And then, in a line preserved in his own account that carries the particular weight of a man who knew exactly where he had placed his bet, he told them where the victory would begin. From the cohorts of the 4th line, positioned to counter the cavalry, he declared, the outcome of the day would be decided. He was right. He would be proven right within hours. The question was whether 60 seconds of tactical surprise could neutralize 7,000 horsemen and 30 years of Roman military tradition. When the signal to advance was given on the morning of August 9th, 48 BCE, the first man to move across the Pharsalian plain was not a general. Gaius Crastinus had been the primus pilus of Caesar's elite 10th legion the previous year. First centurion, the highest non-commissioned rank in the Roman military. the officer who commanded the first century of the first cohort, the man who would be literally at the tip of any engagement. That position, earned through demonstrated valor across Caesar's entire Gallic campaign, had qualified Crestinus for retirement and the economic benefits that accompanied honorable service. He had taken it. He was done. Then he re-enlisted. Not because he was ordered to. He was a volunteer. Caesar's own account is explicit about this. But because he chose to. He had fought through every year of the Gallic Wars, had been at Alesia when Vercingetorix surrendered, had earned Caesar's personal assessment as a man of remarkable valor and singular bravery. When the Civil War began, when the army he had served for a decade crossed the Adriatic and marched toward its collision with Pompey, Crestinus decided that his service was not, in fact, complete. Caesar preserves his speech to the waiting soldiers verbatim, or at least in the form his account presents as verbatim. And modern scholars have noted that the language precisely mirrors Caesar's own stated justifications for the Civil War, suggesting Caesar shaped the presentation, what the speech communicated, not filtered through whatever political framing surrounded it, was the ethos of men who had been fighting together long enough to have stopped being soldiers and become something more personal than that. "Follow me, my old comrades," Caesar's account has him say, "and display such exertions on behalf of your general as you have determined to do. This is our last battle, and when it shall be won, he will recover his dignity, and we our liberty." He turned to Caesar directly. "General, I will act in such a manner today that you will feel grateful to me, living or dead." Then he ran toward the enemy. Approximately 120 volunteers from the same century followed him. What happened next is one of the most remarkable tactical moments in ancient military history, documented by Caesar himself precisely because it had no precedent in his experience. As the Caesarian lines advanced at the charge toward Pompey's stationary formation, they realized the Pompeian legions were not moving to meet them. Standard Roman tactical doctrine, the product of centuries of military tradition, assumed the charge. The collision of two advancing lines, the javelins launched at close range, the momentum of armored men crashing into each other. Pompey had been advised by Gaius Triarius to have his men stand their ground and receive the charge, reasoning that Caesar's soldiers would exhaust themselves running double the usual distance, while the Pompeian legions waited fresh and in formation. Caesar's veterans, assessing the situation without orders, made a decision that Caesar records as extraordinary. They stopped. The midfield between the two armies, with 50,000 enemy soldiers waiting for them, they halted, rested, dressed their ranks, and then resumed the charge. Military historians reading this moment recognize something significant in it. This was not a pause born of fear or confusion. This was an army experienced enough to understand, without being told, that charging into a stationary enemy with exhausted legs was tactically inferior to charging with fresh ones. The discipline it required, to stop mid-charge in front of the enemy in the summer heat of the Thessalian plain, was the product of years of Gallic warfare and absolute confidence in the men beside you. When the lines finally met, both armies launched their pila, the heavy javelins that were the standard opening of Roman infantry combat, and drew their gladi. The Pompeian center held. 10 men deep, mass and weight compensating for whatever their lines lacked in individual quality. Pompey's Syrian legions and Italian veterans absorbed the impact of the Caesarian charge. The battle became a grinding, exhausting infantry engagement. Caesar's first and second lines, already depleted from Dyrrhachium and the hardships of the Thessalian retreat, bore the full weight of this contact phase without resolution. This was exactly what Pompey's plan required. The infantry held. The front was stable, which meant Titus Labienus, positioned on the Pompeian left with 7,000 cavalry, archers, and slingers, could begin the phase of the battle that the whole strategy had been built around. He gave the order to charge. Pompey had 7,000 cavalry. Caesar had 1,000. Mathematics said the left flank was already decided. Titus Labienus was not simply Pompey's cavalry commander. He was, in the assessment of military historians analyzing the Civil War period, the most dangerous man in the Pompeian camp. More dangerous, arguably, than Pompey himself in the specific tactical context of Pharsalus. Labienus had served as Caesar's second-in-command throughout the entire Gallic campaign. He had fought alongside Caesar's veterans for a decade. He knew how they thought, how they responded under pressure, where their formations were trained to go and where they instinctively hesitated. When he defected to Pompey at the war's outset, the only senior Caesarian legate to do so, Caesar's response was reportedly to send back all of Labienus's personal baggage and possessions. An act of ostentatious magnanimity that said everything about how seriously Caesar took the defection as a propaganda problem. Labienus launched his force with the confidence of a man who believed he had already won the calculation. 7,000 cavalry, backed by the entire complement of Pompeian archers and slingers, thundered across the flat Thessalian plain toward Caesar's right wing and its 1,000 Germanic and Gallic horsemen. The disparity was not subtle. It was 7-1. Caesar's cavalry engaged and immediately began giving ground. The Pompeian horsemen pushed harder, the weight of 7,000 horses against 1,000 in arithmetic that played out in real time exactly as it was supposed to. Caesar records observing this from his position on the right wing. He had specifically placed himself there to manage precisely this moment. His cavalry was retreating, not routing, not collapsing entirely, but giving ground in the controlled way that experienced horsemen give ground when they face overwhelming numbers they cannot match. The Pompeian cavalry was beginning to deploy into separate squadrons, the maneuver that would allow them to wheel around Caesar's exposed flank and complete the envelopment that was Pompey's entire strategic premise. Within minutes, thousands of enemy cavalry would be behind Caesar's legionaries, attacking from the rear while the Pompeian infantry pressed from the front. The battle would be over. Labienus knew it. His cavalry knew it. And Pompey, watching from his position behind the left wing, saw everything unfolding as designed. The problem, the catastrophic, irreversible problem, was that none of them knew what was waiting for them on the other side of Caesar's retreating horsemen. There is a distinctive quality to the accounts of what happened next that historians who have studied ancient battle narratives recognize as rare. The description of something that genuinely surprised both armies. Caesar's account, which is naturally shaped by his purposes, records the outcome with a precision that suggests it unfolded exactly as he had calculated. What the ancient sources collectively convey, however, is that the cavalry on both sides experienced the emergence of Caesar's fourth line as something that broke the coherence of what had been a logically developing tactical situation. Labienus's cavalry, in wheeling to complete the encirclement of Caesar's right, found infantry rising from concealment and charging toward them. Infantry, charging cavalry. This was not, in the tactical lexicon of 1st century BCE warfare, supposed to happen. Cavalry outran infantry. Cavalry rode down infantry. Infantry did not charge cavalry. The entire established relationship between these force types assumed that infantry would either hold ground defensively or advance toward other infantry. The sight of several thousand soldiers running directly at several thousand horses carrying armored men was not simply unexpected. It was, in the specific psychological context of Labienus's well-born cavalry, deeply wrong. Caesar had calculated this. He had known exactly what his fourth line would face, and he had given them specific instructions about how to face it. The instructions were documented by Caesar himself and independently confirmed 60 years later by the Roman military theorist Frontinus in his compilation of military stratagems. One of the few tactical details from Farsalus to receive this kind of dual-source verification. The instruction was this: do not throw the pila. Here is the tactical innovation that military academies have studied for 2,000 years. And here is what made it work. Caesar's fourth line had been ordered, specifically and deliberately, not to use their pila as throwing weapons. The pilum, the heavy Roman javelin, weighted at the shaft with an iron shank designed to penetrate shields and bend on impact to prevent reuse, was the standard Roman infantry opening move, unlaunched at close range to disorder the enemy line before the sword charge. Against cavalry, a volley of pila might wound horses, might slow a charge, might kill riders. These were the obvious uses of the weapon. Caesar had identified a less obvious use. He ordered his fourth-line cohorts to hold their pila and use them as thrusting weapons, essentially as poles or pikes, held at shoulder height and advanced at the faces of the Pompeian cavalry. This instruction appears in Caesar's own commentaries, Book 3, Chapter 93, and is independently corroborated by Frontinus in his Stratagemata, compiled around 84 to 96 CE, specifically in the section cataloging successful military stratagems worth preserving for future commanders. On the dual-source verification of this specific detail, a primary account and an independent ancient military manual, 60 years apart, gives it a degree of documentary confidence that few individual tactical decisions from antiquity can claim. The reasoning Caesar provides, filtered through his own account and therefore potentially shaped by his purposes, is psychological. Labienus's cavalry was composed substantially of young men from Rome's aristocratic and allied families, men who valued their physical appearance, their social status, the faces they presented to the world. Thrusting spears aimed specifically at their eyes, their throats, their faces, was not simply a physical threat. It was a particular kind of threat designed to create a particular kind of terror. Men who would ride into conventional combat with professional courage might break when confronted with the specific prospect of being disfigured by an infantry weapon they could not have anticipated. The theory is Caesar's own stated reasoning. Whether it explains the cavalry's response as precisely as he implies is something historians continue to assess. What is documented in Caesar's account and supported by the overall picture multiple ancient sources provide is the result. Not a man of them stood, Caesar records, but all wheeling about not only quitted their post, but galloped forward to seek a refuge in the highest mountains. 7,000 cavalry, gone, not pushed back, not fighting a rearguard action, not retreating to reform, fleeing the field entirely. He's making for the hills on the opposite side of the road from where the main battle was happening. The sheer completeness of the route is striking even by the standards of ancient battle narratives. Where the losing side's collapse tends to be described in terms that maximize the victor's achievement. What followed immediately confirms that the cavalry's flight was total. The archers and slingers who had been sheltering behind the cavalry mass were left completely exposed, without the horsemen who were supposed to protect them. And Caesar's fourth-line cohorts cut through them without organized resistance. Then, the fourth line turned. Rather than pursuing the fleeing cavalry further, Caesar's cohorts wheeled, pivoting from the direction of pursuit into a new axis of attack. The target was the exposed left flank and rear of Pompey's main infantry line, Lucius Domitius Ahenobarbus's legions, which had been locked in frontal combat with Caesarian infantry for the duration of the engagement, found themselves suddenly attacked from a direction they had no formation to meet, by troops they had not known were on the field. Caesar records the mechanics precisely. The cohorts, pursuing their success, wheeled about upon Pompey's left wing, while his infantry still continued to make battle and attacked them in the rear. Simultaneously, Caesar committed his third line, the reserve he had held completely out of the frontal engagement until this exact moment. Fresh soldiers crashed into Pompey's exhausted first and second lines from the front, while the fourth line struck from behind, and the tactical result was mathematically inevitable. New and fresh troops having come to the assistance of the fatigued, and others having made an attack on their rear, Pompey's men were not able to maintain their ground, but all fled. Caesar had predicted, in his pre-battle address to his soldiers, that the victory would originate from those cohorts positioned to counter the cavalry. He was correct in every detail. The cavalry was repulsed, the archers were massacred, the left wing was surrounded, and the rout began there and spread outward. From his position on the right wing, watching his carefully prepared response unfold exactly as designed, Caesar gave the final order of the active engagement: advance. The Battle of Farsalus had lasted by ancient battle standards not long, and the sun had risen well before the fighting began and was approaching its midday position when the Pompeian center finally broke. Caesar's soldiers had been fighting in the full heat of a Thessalian August. They were exhausted, depleted, months removed from adequate supply, and they had just destroyed the largest Roman army ever assembled against a Roman commander. From behind his left wing, Pompey watched his cavalry disappear into the hills. He watched his missile troops die in place without the cavalry that should have protected them. He watched his left flank crumble under an attack that had come from nowhere. And then, according to every ancient account that describes this moment, he stopped giving orders. 30 years of military glory ended not in a final stand or a desperate cavalry charge, but in a single minute of silence inside a command tent. Caesar's own account of Pompey's response is clinical, brief, and devastating. But when Pompey saw his cavalry routed, and that part of his army on which he reposed his greatest hopes thrown into confusion, despairing of the rest, he quitted the field and retreated straightway on horseback to his camp. He did not rally his center. He did not attempt to reposition his right wing. He did not issue orders for a fighting withdrawal that might have preserved some portion of his force. He rode to his camp, dismounted, entered his command tent, and sat down in silence. Plutarch's account, drawing on earlier sources, including the eyewitness historian Asinius Pollio, are records that generals and officers had to physically force Pompey to leave the camp when the Caesarian assault reached the fortifications. He had stopped functioning as a commander. The defeat had been so complete, the plan on which everything depended had failed so absolutely, that something in Pompey's capacity to respond had simply closed. Military historians analyzing this behavior have offered various frameworks for understanding it. The most straightforward is that Pompey had concentrated virtually everything: his best infantry, his entire cavalry, all his missile support, his own personal command presence, into the one wing whose destruction could not be recovered from. The plan had no contingency because no contingency had been imagined. When 7,000 cavalry were routed by infantry they had not expected to encounter, the tactical failure was not just a setback in one sector. It was the collapse of the entire premise. Pompey had believed in the mathematics so completely that when the mathematics failed, he had no alternative framework to fall back on. What the Pompeian camp contained when Caesar's soldiers broke through its defenses became one of the most frequently cited details in ancient accounts of the battle. Preserved by Plutarch and Appian, who drew on Pollio's eyewitness history and therefore carrying the reliability of sources connected to someone who was actually there. The tents were prepared for a victory celebration that had not happened. Fresh turf had been laid out for dining. Silver plate was arrayed for a feast. And the senators who had accompanied Pompey's camp had been so confident of the battle's outcome that some had spent the morning discussing which of Caesar's supporters' properties they intended to confiscate. The contrast between the luxury of what Caesar's soldiers found and the desolation of what the Pompeian cause had become, by the afternoon of August 9th, was captured in ancient accounts as the definitive image of overconfidence. Among the debris of that overconfidence, the abandoned silver, the uneaten feast, the scattered correspondence, Caesar made a decision that reveals as much about his political intelligence as any tactical choice in the battle. He burned Pompey's letters. He did not read them. And the practical consequence was that he denied himself intelligence about which senators and client kings had been in communication with Pompey during the war. The political consequence was that he denied his enemies the fear that he possessed that intelligence. He would pardon everyone who came to him. The letters, if they had existed in Caesar's hands, would have been permanent leverage. He chose not to have leverage. He chose, or appeared to choose, something closer to closure. Pompey himself did not remain in the camp long enough to witness any of this. He had changed into ordinary civilian clothes, abandoning the military regalia of a Roman proconsul, the visible markers of everything he had been for 30 years, and slipped away before the Caesarian assault reached the fortifications. He made for the coast. He would travel to Mytilene to collect his wife Cornelia, then hold a council of his remaining advisors about what remained to be done, then eventually sail for Egypt. The man who had boasted about stamping his foot and raising armies from Italian soil left the Pharsalian plain disguised as a commoner. That phrasing might seem like dramatic license, but the ancient sources are specific. He changed his clothes. He evaded capture. He fled. 30 years of victories had created an identity so dependent on the expectation of winning that the first decisive loss did not merely defeat him. It unmade him. He would never command a Roman army again. An army stops being an army at the precise moment more men are running than fighting. At Farsalus, that moment arrived suddenly and spread in every direction at once. The cascade collapse that followed the destruction of Pompey's left wing was not the result of cowardice. It was the result of tactical isolation. Metellus Scipio's Syrian legions in the center had been locked in frontal combat for the duration of the battle, holding their position against Caesar's thinned but veteran lines. They had done what they were supposed to do. But holding a frontal position in a three-line Roman battle formation depends on the integrity of what is happening on your flanks. When the left wing disintegrated, when the cavalry that was supposed to be completing an envelopment was instead fleeing for the hills, when fresh Caesarian troops suddenly appeared on the flank and rear of the entire Pompeian line, the center's tactical situation changed from holding to encirclement. Men who had been fighting competently a moment before found themselves fighting a battle whose geometry had been inverted. They broke. Not all at once. Ancient battles rarely collapse with the uniformity that later accounts sometimes suggest. But in the cascading fashion that military historians recognize as the characteristic signature of formations that lose faith in their flanks before they lose faith in themselves. Once one cohort turned, the gap it left made the cohorts adjacent to it more vulnerable, which accelerated their own collapse, which widened the gap. The mathematics of infantry panic are self-accelerating. Caesar records the outcome with the brevity appropriate to an account written by the man who caused it. Pompey's men were not able to maintain their ground, but all fled. Men threw down their weapons, and they dropped their military standards, the unit flags whose protection was, in Roman military culture, an obligation as serious as any other. Because running with a standard made you identifiable. made you a target and slowed you down. The field of the Pharsalian plain became littered with the equipment of an army, shedding the material evidence of what it had been. Despite the exhaustion of his troops, the battle had continued until near midday in the full heat of a Thessalian August. Caesar ordered an immediate assault on Pompey's camp rather than allowing his soldiers to rest. He understood what every experienced commander understands: that an enemy given time to regroup behind fortifications has traded tactical defeat for strategic survival, and that the price of that gift would be paid in blood in a future engagement. The camp was defended by 7 cohorts who had been left as garrison, and by Thracian auxiliaries who fought with more determination than the broken Pompeians streaming back from the battlefield. Caesar's account notes specifically that the Thracians held the ramparts with more resolve than those arriving from the lost battle, who were thinking more of further flight than of the defense of the camp. The camp fell. The pursuit extended beyond the camp to the nearby hills, where a substantial portion of the Pompeian army had sought refuge. Caesar records that approximately 4 legions surrendered at a position northeast of the battlefield near Larissa. These soldiers, the core of Pompey's professional Roman infantry, were spared under the clemency policy that Caesar had been applying consistently since the war began. He offered them integration into his own forces or return home. He did not execute men whose only offense was having served on the wrong side of a Roman civil war. Among those killed in the flight rather than captured on the field was Lucius Domitius Ahenobarbus, the commander of Pompey's left wing. Caesar records his death specifically in his commentaries. Lucius Domitius, in his flight from the camp to the mountain, was slain by the cavalry, his strength having failed him from fatigue. Ahenobarbus had been the Senate's designated replacement for Caesar as governor of Gaul, perhaps the most personally offensive appointment the Senate had made in the entire conflict. He died not in heroic last-ditch combat, but exhausted and fleeing, his strength gone before the cavalry that ran him down arrived. And this was not an uncommon way to die in an ancient route. But the specific detail Caesar preserves has the quality of documentation rather than gloating. The pursuit continued until Caesar called it off at a tactically reasonable distance, far enough to inflict substantial additional casualties on the fleeing force, close enough to maintain his army's cohesion and prevent the fragmentation that aggressive pursuit can cause. He was concerned, according to his own account, about Pompey's documented ability to regroup rapidly. He was also aware, though he does not say this explicitly, that the civil war was not over. Cato the Younger was in Africa. Metellus Scipio would escape. Pompey himself was still alive. The campaign had won its decisive engagement. The war required several more years. When the sun descended toward the western hills, the Pharsalian plain belonged to Silence and the Caesarian army. The mathematics that had seemed so overwhelmingly in Pompey's favor that morning had produced a result that inverted every expectation. What was left on the field would tell the full story. When Caesar's men counted what was left on the Pharsalian plain, they found evidence of a disaster more complete than any in living Roman memory. Caesar's own commentaries provide the casualty figures for Farsalus in Book 3, Chapter 99. Approximately 15,000 Pompeian soldiers dead and more than 24,000 taken prisoner. For his own side, Caesar reports no more than 200 privates were missing, along with approximately 30 centurions killed. 180 military standards had been captured. 9 legionary eagles had been taken, and these figures require immediate context. Caesar was writing a document explicitly designed to justify his actions and demonstrate his greatness. Ancient authors, including Asinius Pollio, who was present at Farsalus as one of Caesar's own legates, later criticized the commentaries for inaccuracy and lack of care. Pollio's own history of the period, now lost but preserved in fragments through Appian and other later writers, recorded Pompeian dead at approximately 6,000. The range of 6,000 to 15,000 represents the genuine scholarly uncertainty about Pompeian killed, with many modern historians treating Pollio's figure, that of an eyewitness with no obvious motivation to minimize the losses, as more reliable than Caesar's higher count. Caesar's figure for his own losses is almost universally regarded by modern military historians as implausibly low. Consider the internal evidence alone. He records 30 centurions killed. Centurions were the front-line combat leaders of Roman formations. They fought at the leading edge of every engagement, and their casualties tend to reflect the actual intensity of the fighting more accurately than private soldier counts. 30 centurions dead from a force of 22,000 legionaries in a battle that involved sustained infantry combat against a numerically superior enemy implies a total casualty figure substantially higher than 200 privates. Modern historians estimate actual Caesarian losses at somewhere between 1,200 and 3,000 killed and wounded, and though this remains speculation in the strict sense, we have no alternative ancient figure to anchor it. What is not speculative, what all ancient sources confirm across their significant differences on other details, is the 9 legionary eagles. A Roman legionary eagle, the aquila, carried by the eagle-bearer of each legion, was the sacred emblem of an entire military unit. To lose it in battle was considered catastrophic dishonor. Rome had famously spent decades pursuing the eagles lost to Arminius in the Teutoburg forest. 9 eagles represented 9 Pompeian legions effectively destroyed as organized fighting entities. Combined with 180 unit standards, the subordinate symbols of cohort and manipular identity. The physical evidence scattered across the Pharsalian plain told a story more eloquent than casualty figures. The organizational identity of the Pompeian army had been comprehensively erased. The 24,000 prisoners figure is broadly accepted by historians, and it carries its own remarkable arithmetic. Caesar had begun the day with approximately 22,000 legionaries. He ended it holding prisoner a force larger than his entire army had been. Among the dead was Gaius Crastinus. Caesar records his end in chapter 99 of the 3rd book of his civil war, in the same passage where he accounts for the battle's broader losses. Crastinus also, of whom mention was made before, fighting most courageously, lost his life by the wound of a sword in the mouth. Nor was that false which he declared when marching to battle. The specific nature of the wound, a sword thrust through the mouth, has the particularity of eyewitness detail. Caesar's assessment follows immediately. He entertained the highest opinion of his behavior in that battle and thought him highly deserving of his approbation. Appian's later account, drawing on sources closer to the event, records that Caesar honored Crastinus with a burial mound and erected an altar specifically in recognition of his conduct at Farsalus. An extraordinary posthumous distinction for a non-commissioned soldier. The retired centurion who walked back toward war had told Caesar he would earn his gratitude living or dead. He kept his word exactly. The battle's physical evidence, the weapons, and the abandoned equipment, the scattered standards, the 9 sacred eagles, lay across approximately 3 square miles of Thessalian valley as the August sun moved toward evening. Pompey's camp yielded silver plate prepared for a celebration that never happened. The senator's correspondence revealed the confidence of men who had been settling the post-war world before the battle was fought. And somewhere in the hills northeast of the battlefield, 4 Pompeian legions were deciding that their war was over. Caesar's war was not. But its most important single day was done. after Pharsalus, Pompey had one question: where in the world was still safe for the man Caesar had just destroyed? The geography of his options had narrowed dramatically. The Eastern Mediterranean had been his operational base for decades, the network of client kingdoms that bore his personal imprint from his campaigns against Mithridates and his reorganization of Rome's eastern frontier. But those client relationships had been built on the premise of Pompey's power. And power, as Pompey now had direct evidence, was not permanent. Africa was an option. Cato the Younger was there, organizing continued resistance with the forces that had escaped from the battle. Parthia was conceivable, but represented the empire that had killed Crassus. And seeking refuge with Rome's most persistent eastern enemy would be a political statement that would follow him for the rest of his life. Egypt was the choice that made practical sense. The young King Ptolemy the 13th, 13 years old, controlled by advisors, was the son of a man Pompey had once helped restore to his throne. Egypt was fabulously wealthy, strategically useful, and geographically accessible. Pompey sailed first to Mytilene, where he collected his wife Cornelia, then held a council of war with his remaining officers. The decision for Egypt was made with whatever hope remained for a man who had gone from commanding the combined resources of the Roman Senate and its eastern allies to sailing with a small fleet and a shattered reputation. The advisors surrounding Ptolemy the 13th understood the political mathematics of the situation with more clarity than sentiment. Caesar was coming. The Battle of Farsalus had made that evident. Caesar was winning. The battle had made that incontestable. Between extending hospitality to a defeated general and thereby risking Caesar's wrath, and offering Caesar a demonstration of Egyptian loyalty by eliminating his most significant remaining enemy, the calculus pointed in one direction. Later, ancient accounts summarize the advisors' reasoning in terms that scholars have generally accepted as capturing their actual logic, even if the specific formulations are later elaborations. That a dead man causes no trouble. Pompey arrived at Pelusium on the Egyptian coast on September 28th, 48 BCE, one day before his 58th birthday. A small boat was sent to bring him ashore. The boat carried, among others, a Roman named Lucius Septimius, a soldier who had served under Pompey in the east and had subsequently been stationed in Egypt as part of the Roman military presence there. Pompey, recognizing a former soldier, may have expected the connection to provide some assurance of safe conduct. What it provided instead was the proximity of a man who knew how to use a sword. The assassination was swift. As Pompey prepared to step onto the shore, with his wife watching from the deck of the ship, which had stood off at a distance, he was stabbed. He died on the beach at Pelusium. His head was cut off. His body was left on the sand until a former soldier named Philippus, who had served Pompey loyally, gave it a basic burial using materials from a wrecked vessel nearby. The head was embalmed and preserved, intended as a gift for the man who was still pursuing the dead general across the eastern Mediterranean. Caesar reached Alexandria on October 2nd, 48 BCE. When Ptolemy's ministers presented him with Pompey's severed head, meant the accounts that survived from the ancient world, Cassius Dio, Plutarch drawing on earlier sources, other writers of varying reliability, converge on a consistent response. Caesar turned away. Multiple ancient accounts record that he wept. Whether the tears were genuine grief for a man who had once been his ally and his son-in-law, through the daughter Julia, whose death had helped precipitate everything, whether they were calculated political theater designed to present Caesar as magnanimous rather than triumphant, or whether they were simply the involuntary response of a man who had been pursuing another man for months and found, at journey's end, a head in a box, is something no ancient source explains and no modern historian can determine. What is documented is that Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus died on September 28th, 48 BCE, one day before his 58th birthday. He had earned the title Great at 23. He lost it, finally, irreversibly, at 57, on a beach in a country he had once saved, killed by a man who used to serve him. He had celebrated 3 triumphs, cleared the Mediterranean of pirates, defeated Mithridates, reorganized Rome's eastern world, and for 30 years been the most powerful man in the Roman Republic. History preserved his hubris. It did not preserve his plan. Caesar won the battle in hours. The political question of what to do with the victory would take the rest of his life, and he would never fully answer it. His first decisions were deliberate and revealing. He burned Pompey's correspondence rather than reading it. A choice that denied him whatever intelligence those letters contained about which senators and client kings had been in contact with the Pompeian camp during the war. The practical cost of this decision was real. The political value was larger. Caesar was signaling, visibly and immediately, that he was not going to use the battle spoils to compile a list of enemies. He announced that all who came to him would be forgiven. He meant it, or performed it so consistently across so many years, that the distinction becomes less important than the effect. Among the first men to come to him was Marcus Junius Brutus. Brutus had fought for Pompey at Pharsalus, fighting, in his own understanding, for the Republic against the general who was destroying it. After the rout, Brutus had made his way through marshland to Larissa and written to Caesar seeking pardon. Caesar responded immediately and warmly. Ancient sources note that Caesar had explicitly instructed his forces to preserve Brutus's life if he was found on the battlefield, a detail that speaks to the personal character of whatever relationship bound them. Whether Caesar's feeling for Brutus was primarily genuine affection, rooted partly in his long relationship with Brutus's mother Servilia, or primarily political calculation, Brutus's impeccable republican credentials gave Caesar's clemency a legitimacy that pardoning ordinary soldiers could not. The behavior was consistent. Caesar showered Brutus with honors over the following years: governorship of Cisalpine Gaul in 47 BCE, the urban praetorship, one of Rome's most prestigious offices, in 44, designation for the consulship in 41. No man in Rome received more visible demonstrations of Caesar's trust. The irony that this generosity helped produce the assassination of 44 BCE is one of history's more precisely documented paradoxes. The Pompeian cause did not collapse at Farsalus. Cato the Younger, the Senate's most uncompromising defender of republican tradition, refused to seek pardon. He traveled to Africa, where he organized continued resistance under Metellus Scipio. Pompey's sons, Gnaeus and Sextus, escaped and continued fighting. Titus Labienus escaped the Pharsalian battlefield and joined the African resistance, he bringing with him his intimate knowledge of Caesar's tactics and the specific humiliation of having designed the cavalry assault whose failure had determined the day. The campaigns required to complete the civil war took 3 more years. The Battle of Thapsus in Africa in 46 BCE destroyed Metellus Scipio's forces. Cato, upon hearing of the defeat, killed himself rather than accept Caesar's pardon, the act of a man who had too much philosophical consistency to pretend that living under Caesar's forgiveness was equivalent to living under the Republic. The Battle of Munda in Spain in 45 BCE killed Labienus and broke the last organized Pompeian resistance. Caesar returned to Rome as the undisputed victor of the Roman world. What he had won, exactly, was the question Rome could not answer, for Caesar moved quickly to accumulate formal recognitions of his position. dictator for various periods. Then in February 44 BCE, dictator perpetuo, dictator in perpetuity. The Latin is precise, and its implications were unambiguous to anyone who understood Roman constitutional history. There had never been a permanent dictator. The office was designed as a temporary expedient, a concentrated grant of power for a specific crisis, revoked when the crisis passed. A permanent dictator was something Roman political language had no honest word for. It was what it looked like. The senators who had survived Pharsalus, who had accepted Caesar's clemency, who had watched him accumulate powers that the Republic had been specifically designed to prevent any single man from holding, began making calculations. The calculation that mattered was made by Brutus, the man Caesar had most visibly honored and most completely trusted. And the conclusion Brutus reached was the one that Caesar's accumulated power had made, in some sense, inevitable. Whether Caesar was loved, feared, or both, Farsalus had made him unchallengeable by conventional means. The Republic he claimed to have gone to war to protect, his dignity, his liberty, his right to seek the consulship without surrender of his command, had instead been delivered into his permanent keeping. The question of who would eventually object to that arrangement, and how, was the question that would define the final years of Caesar's life. The answer stood in the front row of the Senate on the Ides of March. When the screaming stopped and the Thessalian plain went quiet, and what was left was a record written in material rather than words. Bodies and ancient sources give us ranges for the dead that span from Pollio's 6,000 to Caesar's 15,000, lay across approximately 3 square miles of valley, concentrated most densely in the areas where the wing battles had been decided. The right side of the Caesarian line, where the fourth line had emerged and the cavalry engagement had been destroyed, would have shown the particular density of a position where the tactical action had been most concentrated and most conclusive. The area around the Pompeian camp would have shown its own evidence: the detritus of a garrison overwhelmed, the abandoned equipment of men who had stripped themselves of anything identifiable as military so they could run faster. Among the physical evidence was, and by ancient accounts, the equipment of an army that had prepared for victory rather than defeat. Lucius Domitius Ahenobarbus had died in flight, his strength gone before the cavalry pursuing him arrived. Caesar records this specifically in his commentaries, the detail carrying the particular note of a man documenting something his sources had confirmed. 10 senators were numbered among the confirmed Pompeian dead. The men who had been debating post-war property confiscations that morning had not all survived to be embarrassed by the morning's agenda. 9 legionary eagles lay somewhere among the taken standards, seized from units that no longer existed as coherent military formations. In Roman military culture, the eagle's loss was among the most profound institutional dishonors a legion could experience. 9 eagles from 9 legions, taken in a single day by a force smaller than the force that had lost them. No one who understood Roman military tradition could misread what the tally of those eagles meant. The Pompeian camp itself became a kind of archaeological record of overconfidence. Plutarch and Appian, drawing on Pollio's eyewitness account, described the scene with details that carry the ring of testimony. The tents shaded with ivy, the fresh turf laid for dining, the silver plate arranged for a feast. The senators had brought their expectations of victory with them in material form, and those expectations were now part of the debris. Caesar's soldiers, who had been living on root bread and the memories of Dyrrachium, found themselves in possession of luxury they had no context for. On what Caesar found in those tents, or what he chose not to find, shaped the political meaning of the battle's aftermath as much as any tactical decision of the day itself. By burning the correspondence without reading it, he converted the physical evidence of Pompeian political networking into ash. He denied himself the leverage of knowing who had written to whom. He denied his enemies the fear of that knowledge. The gesture was simultaneously magnanimous and masterful. Caesar understood that winning a civil war required more than defeating an army. It required giving the defeated something to come back to. The battlefield today is agricultural land. The modern town of Pharsala in Thessaly, Greece, approximately 3.5 hours from Athens by road, marks the general area. The scholarly consensus, following Morgan's 1983 analysis confirmed by its alignment with ancient source descriptions, places the battlefield approximately 10 miles northwest of the modern town, along the Enopeus River. No monuments mark the site. No plaques commemorate where the fourth line rose from concealment, where Labienus's cavalry fled for the hills, where Crastinus led his volunteers across 300 yards of Thessalian grass. It is fields. The kind of land that has been farmed for 2,000 years without any particular awareness of what happened there once, in August of 48 BCE, when mathematics collided with preparation and preparation won. The Enopeus River still runs through what was once the plain of Farsalus. The hills that anchored the Pompeian position are still there. The gap in the valley where Caesar's cavalry once held its ground and then retreated and then watched infantry do what infantry was not supposed to do has no marker. The earth absorbed what it needed to absorb and moved on. History has not always been as practical. Farsalus ended the Republic as a practical reality. It took 4 more years, an assassination, and another civil war for everyone to admit it. Caesar's victory gave him the military supremacy that Roman constitutional arrangements had been designed over 5 centuries to prevent any single individual from achieving. He was named dictator for the second time shortly after Pharsalus, then for longer periods in subsequent years. Then in February 44 BCE, the Senate voted him dictator perpetuo, dictator in perpetuity, a formal designation for what was, in everything except its name, a monarchy. He sat on a golden throne in the Senate. He received divine honors. He refused, in a famous public performance with Mark Antony, the physical crown itself. But the substance of kingship was present in everything surrounding the gesture of refusal. The 3 years between Pharsalus and the Ides of March were filled with campaigns. The Battle of Thapsus in Africa in 46 BCE was the decisive engagement against the remaining Pompeian resistance under Metellus Scipio, supported by King Juba of Numidia. Scipio's forces were destroyed. Cato the Younger, hearing of the defeat at his position in Utica, spent his last hours reading Plato's Phaedo, the dialogue about the immortality of the soul, and then killed himself. His suicide was an act of philosophical consistency. He had spent his public life arguing that a republic without virtue was not worth inhabiting. He declined to inhabit what came next. Titus Labienus, who had designed the cavalry assault whose failure determined Farsalus, was killed at the Battle of Munda in Spain in 45 BCE, the final engagement of the Civil War. Caesar buried him with full military honors, a final gesture of respect for the man who had been his second in command for the Gallic Wars and his most dangerous opponent in the Civil War. The respect was genuine, or performed with the consistency that made its genuineness irrelevant. Caesar returned to Rome in 45 BCE as the undisputed master of the Roman world. He had accumulated, by that point, new powers and honors with no precedent in 500 years of Roman history. He was perpetual dictator, holder of tribunician sacrosanctity, commander of all Roman armies, and the recipient of divine honors that placed him in an ambiguous position between the human and the divine that Roman Republican tradition had no framework for accommodating. The conspiracy that formed around Marcus Junius Brutus and Gaius Cassius Longinus drew in approximately 60 senators. Brutus, the man Caesar had pardoned at Pharsalus, honored above almost all others in the years since, and designated for the consulship in 41 BCE, was its most important member precisely because of what his participation said about Caesar's reign. If the man Caesar most trusted and most favored believed Caesar had to be killed, or if the argument had a force that Cassius alone, who was known to hate Caesar personally, could not have provided. On March 15th, 44 BCE, in the Curia of Pompey, a legislative chamber in the theater complex that Pompey himself had built and given to Rome, approximately 60 senators surrounded Caesar as he arrived to attend the Senate's meeting. They stabbed him 23 times. Ancient sources record that Caesar initially resisted, but when he saw Brutus approaching with a dagger, he ceased to struggle. What he said, if anything, in those final moments is not recorded with any certainty. The phrase et tu, brute, is Shakespeare's invention, brilliant theater, but not history. Suetonius and Cassius Dio, writing as the closest sources to the moment, note only that Caesar may have spoken Greek words of bitter recognition, and both acknowledge the uncertainty. It may have happened too fast for speech. The assassination did not restore the Republic. It produced exactly what Brutus feared most, and what the conspirators had specifically tried to prevent through the decision not to kill Mark Antony alongside Caesar. Another civil war, the conflict between Caesar's heir Octavian and Antony against Brutus and Cassius, played out over the following 2 years. At the Battle of Philippi in 42 BCE, Brutus and Cassius faced the combined forces of the Second Triumvirate. Cassius, misinformed about the outcome of the first day's fighting, committed suicide. Brutus fought a second engagement and was also defeated, and also killed himself. He died knowing that the act he had committed in the belief that it would save the Republic had instead accelerated the Republic's end. By 27 BCE, Octavian, now calling himself Augustus, had dispensed with the formalities of republican government entirely and become Rome's first emperor. The 500-year republic was over. The 500-year empire had begun. The irony that historians have never stopped noting: Caesar was killed in the Curia of Pompeii. The building Pompey had constructed, in the theater complex Pompey had given to Rome, was where his conqueror died. Even in death, Caesar could not escape the shadow of the battle that had made him everything. Farsalus appears in the curriculum of virtually every serious military academy in the Western world. Not primarily because of what happened there, but because of what it keeps demonstrating about warfare's most fundamental principles, the ones that technology changes the form of while leaving the substance untouched. The tactical innovation at the center of the battle was documented not only by Caesar himself, but independently confirmed by the Roman military theorist Frontinus in his Stratagemata, compiled approximately 84 to 96 CE, the Roman Empire's practical handbook of military stratagems. Frontinus included the Farsalus fourth line and its face-targeting instruction as a model worth preserving for future commanders. That act of institutional transmission, one general documenting a specific tactical decision, another military thinker codifying it as doctrine worthy of study 60 years later, is how military knowledge actually propagates. The principle embedded in Caesar's fourth line is not specific to Pila and cavalry. It is the general principle of maintaining a concealed reserve for a specific anticipated threat, revealing it at the decisive moment, and using it not just to repel, but to exploit. That principle appears in military doctrine from Napoleon's use of the Old Guard to modern combined arms reserve management. The technology changes. The structure does not. The political lesson of Farsalus is equally durable and considerably more troubling. The historian Paul K. Davis, in his study of decisive battles, wrote that Caesar's victory took him to the pinnacle of power, effectively ending the Republic. That assessment understates the mechanism. Farsalus did not merely give Caesar power. It established, as a demonstrated historical fact that every subsequent Roman ruler understood, that military victory over the Senate could be converted directly into supreme political authority. Every emperor who followed Augustus derived his legitimacy ultimately from military command rather than senatorial election. The men who ran the Roman Empire for the next 500 years understood what Pharsalus had proven, that the army's loyalty, properly cultivated, was the only political reality that ultimately mattered. This is among the most significant political precedents in Western history. Not because the Roman Empire was uniquely important, though it was, but because Roman political and legal forms became the skeleton of medieval European governance, which became in turn the skeleton of modern democratic institutions. The tension between military authority and civilian governance, between the general who has the loyalty of his soldiers and the legislature that has the formal claim to sovereignty, was written into Western political experience at Farsalus and has never entirely disappeared. The battle is also, in the specific sense that military education values most, a masterclass in the defeat of numerical superiority. Caesar was outnumbered approximately 2-1 in infantry and 7-1 in cavalry, had been defeated 6 weeks earlier, and was fighting with troops on reduced supply in summer heat. He won because he had accurately identified the one weakness in Pompey's plan, the cavalry charge that everything depended on, and had prepared a specific counter that Pompey did not know existed. The numbers on the Pompeian side were never irrelevant. They simply could not overcome the gap between a plan that had been thought through to its contingencies and a plan that had assumed numerical superiority was its own contingency. The battlefield today offers none of the monuments that its historical significance might seem to warrant. The area near modern Pharsala, approximately 10 miles northwest of the town, along the Enipeus River Valley, is agricultural land. You can visit. There is no admission charge. There is nothing specific to see. No plaque marks where Crastinus led his volunteers. No marker indicates where the fourth line waited in concealment. The hills where Labienus's cavalry fled are just hills. The river still runs through the valley where Rome's republican constitution effectively ended. The absence of monuments is itself perhaps appropriate. The republic that died at Farsalus left no monument either. Only the empire that replaced it, the legal traditions that the empire propagated, and the enduring argument about whether what was lost was worth what replaced it. Brutus thought so. Caesar didn't think the question was worth asking. Pompey never got to have an opinion. What the plain of Farsalus retains, for those who know what happened there, is the specific quality of a place where everything changed at once. On a morning when one general came down off a hill he should have stayed on, and another general had already been waiting for exactly that decision for months. The lesson doesn't require a monument. It requires only the willingness to understand that numerical advantage is a starting point, not a conclusion. Pompey had the numbers. Caesar had thought harder about what to do when the numbers ran out. On August 9th, 48 BCE, in the heat of a Thessalian summer, the difference between those two approaches was demonstrated on the bodies of approximately 6,000 to 15,000 men, depending on whose account you trust, lying on a plain that does not remember them. The plain, at least. History has been less forgetful. The field is agricultural land now. The Enipeus River still runs through what was the plain of Farsalus, past the hillside where Pompey's camp stood and the valley where the fourth line waited in the August heat. No monuments mark the site. Tourists can visit. There is nothing to see. The earth absorbed what it needed to absorb and moved on. What it cannot absorb, what no ground ever can, and is the chain of consequence. Farsalus did not just end a battle. It ended, not instantly, but decisively and irreversibly, the 500-year Roman Republic. It enabled everything that came after. Caesar's dictatorship, the assassination in the Curia of Pompey, the further civil wars, the emergence of Augustus and the empire that would govern the Mediterranean world for another 5 centuries and whose legal and political DNA is still present in ways scholars continue to trace and debate in the institutions that govern Western societies today. One retired centurion chose to walk back toward the loudest, most dangerous place on earth. He told his general he would earn his gratitude living or dead. He earned it and paid the price that earning it required, and was honored with a burial mound and an altar that no longer exist. A history gives him a paragraph and then moves on to the men whose names are on the monuments. Caesar's 4th line, 6 to 8 cohorts of soldiers whom Pompey didn't know existed, rose from concealment and did something that cavalry is not supposed to survive. An infantry charge aimed at their faces. 7,000 horsemen fled the field. The archers died where they stood. The left flank crumbled. The center followed. Pompey rode to his tent, sat in silence, and then changed his clothes and ran. Among the men Caesar pardoned in the aftermath was Marcus Junius Brutus. Caesar honored him above almost any other senator in the 4 years between Pharsalus and the Ides of March. Brutus killed Caesar anyway, believing it was what the Republic required. The Republic was not restored. The empire Brutus feared came anyway, on just under different management. Farsalus bought 100 years more of Roman internal conflict before the institutions it shattered were replaced by one stable enough to last. Whether that 100 years produced more or less suffering than the alternatives might have produced is a question history poses without answering. What it does answer, with the precision that only documented outcomes can provide, is this. On August 9th, 48 BCE, one commander maintained a concealed reserve and committed it at the moment of maximum effect. And one commander concentrated everything in a single plan and had no answer when that plan failed. The numbers said Pompey should have won. He had twice the infantry, 7 times the cavalry, the high ground, the supply lines, the political legitimacy of the Senate behind him, and 30 years of victories in his record. Preparation beat all of it. On the plain where Crastinus walked toward the enemy, and the 4th line waited in the heat, and Pompey came down from the hill he should never have left. Mathematics ran its calculation and got the wrong answer. Because mathematics only counts what it can see. Caesar had made sure there was something it couldn't.